Part 1. The Fog over Harbor Point. Harbor Point had always been a place frozen in time. Its cobblestone streets, weather-beaten houses, and aging fishing docks creaked like the bones of an old sailor. The town was a hushed symphony of crashing waves and the mournful cries of seagulls, with the occasional whisper of old secrets swirling in the salty breeze. Marian Graves had lived there her entire life. She loved Harbor Point's quiet charm, even if it felt like the town was rotting from the inside. Its isolation didn't bother her. She'd returned after college to teach at the local school, certain that this was where she belonged. But one night, everything changed. Marian woke abruptly to a strange sound. At first, she thought it might have been a dream, but the noise came again, faint and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood, scratching. Her bedroom was bathed in pale moonlight, but beyond the window, the world was shrouded in an unrelenting fog. It clung to the glass like fingers. Marian sat up, her heart racing as the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the window. Her breath quickened. Childhood stories crept into her mind, legends about the fog, about the figures that came with it, whispering names, knocking on doors. If you let them in, the stories warned, you'd never come back. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it felt suffocating. Marian crept to the window, candle holder in hand, and peeked out through the curtain. Nothing. The fog was thick and alive, swirling in unnatural patterns. It shifted, coiling like a serpent, and then parted, revealing something that made her blood freeze. Eyes. Two enormous, burning eyes stared back at her from the darkness, inhuman and searing with malevolence. Marian gasped, stumbling backward. The eyes vanished, leaving only the unbroken fog. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Marian heard the news. 3 teenagers, Tommy, Jennifer, and Ronnie, had disappeared. They'd been inseparable, the kind of friends who were always together, whether on the docks, the beach, or the abandoned fishing shacks on the edge of town. Their parents had assumed they'd spent the night at each other's homes, but by morning, it became clear no one had seen them. The town was shaken. Police and volunteers scoured the area, searching the nearby woods, cliffs, and rocky shoreline. But the fog had settled thick over Harbor Point, its tendrils clinging to the earth, making it almost impossible to see. On the 3rd day of searching, Tommy's backpack washed ashore. It was waterlogged and heavy with sand. The shark-shaped keychain on the zipper confirmed it was his. Inside, the bag was filled with fine white sand that didn't match the coarse, rocky beaches of Harbor Point. But what disturbed the searchers most were the scratches covering the surface of the bag, deep gouges, as if something had clawed at it. Marian couldn't shake the feeling that the disappearances and her encounter with the fog were connected. She began asking around, trying to make sense of it. "You've heard of Alice Carver, haven't you?" her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Howard, asked when Marian stopped by one afternoon. Marian stiffened. Everyone in Harbor Point knew the story of Alice Carver. In 1935, during a week when the fog was thick and heavy, the young girl had vanished. Her parents swore they'd heard her scream, but when they ran to her room, it was empty. The search lasted for weeks, but Alice was never found. "I saw her again," Mrs. Howard whispered, her voice trembling. Marian frowned. "You saw Alice?" "She was in the fog. She stood outside my window. But they were dead. Marian didn't know how to respond. The story sounded like the ramblings of an old woman, but something about Mrs. Howard's tone sent a chill down her spine. A few days later, the town's unease deepened. Henry Bishop, a reclusive fisherman who lived near the shore, was found dead on the beach. His body was twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The coroner reported no signs of external injury, but Henry's hands were raw and bloody, as if he'd been clawing at his own skin. The whispers of a curse began to spread. The old-timers of Harbor Point spoke of lights that would appear in the fog near the bay. Strange, flickering orbs that lured sailors to their doom. Some claimed the lights were ghostly lanterns, held by the spirits of drowned fishermen. Others said they were the work of those who wait, ancient beings that fed on fear and desperation. Marian turned to the school's archives for answers. She found an old newspaper article about Alice Carver's disappearance. It described the fog as unnatural, lingering for weeks after the girl vanished. The only clue left behind was a scrap of fabric caught on the rocks near the old pier. The article ended with a chilling quote from Alice's father. "The fog doesn't leave. It waits." Every night, the fog thickened, wrapping the town in an eerie silence. Marian began hearing the scratching again, louder and closer each time. It wasn't just at her window anymore. One night, the sound moved to her front door. Her breath hitched as she crept into the hallway. The house was deathly quiet, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. The scratching continued, deliberate and slow, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for her to answer. "Marian," a voice whispered. She froze. It was soft and familiar, almost kind, but wrong in a way she couldn't explain. The voice came again, this time louder. "Marian, open the door." Her hands trembled as she reached for the lock. She didn't know why she was doing it. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, but something compelled her forward. She opened the door and stepped into the fog. And she was gone. Part 2. Echoes in the Mist. Harbor Point wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared, not until the fog came. The town was still in shock after the vanishing of 3 teenagers, Tommy, Jennifer, and Ronnie, and the strange death of fisherman Henry Bishop. Fear gripped the town like a vice, but people kept moving forward. It was all they could do. Detective George Ellis arrived a week after Marian Graves disappeared. George wasn't from Harbor Point, and his presence stood out. His polished shoes and sharp demeanor didn't belong here. The locals avoided his questions, retreating behind their guarded, weathered faces. But the whispers reached his ears. "It's the fog," an old fisherman told him. "It takes what it wants." George had handled small-town superstitions before. He was here for answers, not ghost stories. But something about the thick, unnatural mist gave him pause. George stayed at the Harbor Inn, a crumbling bed and breakfast with drafty windows and a faint smell of mildew. He spent his first night combing through the sparse case files. 3 teenagers missing, a school teacher vanishing without a trace. Then there was Henry Bishop, his face frozen in terror, his hands bloodied from clawing at himself. The coroner had no explanation. The innkeeper brought him a cup of tea late that night. "It's always the fog," she murmured. "What do you mean?" George asked. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "It isn't weather. It's something else. People hear voices. They see things, and then they're gone." When she left, George found himself staring into his tea, her words clinging to him like the damp chill in the air. The next day, George began his interviews. At first, the townsfolk offered vague responses. But soon, the stories spilled out, each more unsettling than the last. "Lights in the mist," said one fisherman. "I thought it was a ship, but it moved too fast." "I heard my name," a young woman confessed, her voice trembling. "It was coming from the woods, but it wasn't human. It sounded wrong." Another described waking to find deep scratches covering their windows, as if something had tried to get inside. George didn't believe in curses or monsters, but the consistency of the tales unsettled him. Marion Graves's house was untouched, as if she had simply stepped out and never returned. A cup of tea sat cold on the counter, her bed neatly made. In the bedroom, George noticed faint scratches on the window pane. He leaned in closer, running his fingers over the marks. It looked as though something had dragged claws across the glass. The air in the house felt heavy, as if it still held her fear. Later that afternoon, George visited the cliffs where Tommy's backpack had been found. The jagged rocks jutted out into the sea, battered by waves that roared like distant thunder. The fog hung low, muffling the sound. Standing at the edge, George felt a strange pressure in the air, as if something unseen was watching him. "Detective," George turned sharply. An old man stood a few feet away, leaning on a cane. "Name's Sam," the man said. "I worked with Henry Bishop. Thought I could help." George nodded. "What do you know about Henry's death?" Sam's expression darkened. "Henry wasn't the type to scare easy. But that night, he told me he heard a voice. He said it sounded like his wife, but she's been dead for years." "What else did he say?" Sam hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "He said the fog wasn't natural. It was alive, and it was coming for him." That night, back at the inn, George sat at his desk, staring at his notes. None of it made sense. The fog, the voices, the disappearances. There had to be a logical explanation. A noise broke the silence. Scratching. George froze, listening as the sound grew louder. It was coming from the window. He approached cautiously, his flashlight in hand. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable. And then he saw them. Eyes. Burning, otherworldly eyes stared back at him from the mist. George stumbled backward, his heart pounding. When he looked again, the eyes were gone, but the fog lingered, heavier than before. The next morning, George decided to investigate the abandoned pier. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it cursed. The pier jutted out into the bay, its wood rotting and unstable. As George walked its length, the fog thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud. At the end of the pier, he found a pile of objects: rusted fishing hooks, a child's toy, a wedding ring, offerings. He knelt to inspect them, but a sound stopped him. "Detective." The voice was soft and familiar, but when George turned, no one was there. "Detective," the voice repeated, closer now. George's blood ran cold. The fog seemed to close in around him, the whispers growing louder. "Come closer." He turned and ran, the wood groaning beneath his feet. He didn't stop until he reached solid ground. When he looked back, the pier was empty, swallowed by the mist. George didn't sleep that night. The fog pressed against the windows of the inn, heavy and relentless. He knew he was running out of time. Whatever was in the fog wasn't finished yet. Part 3, The Waiting Depths. The fog over Harbor Point thickened by the day, creeping further into the town and swallowing its streets whole. By now, the people barely left their homes, the whispers of curses and vengeful spirits spreading like wildfire. Detective George Ellis had never believed in the supernatural, but after weeks in Harbor Point, even he wasn't sure what was real anymore. He'd seen the unnatural fog, heard the whispers, seen the fear carved into the faces of the townsfolk. Now, standing at the edge of the cliffs where Tommy's backpack had been found, George couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. George froze. The sound was faint, but it was there, carried on the mist. "Ellis," a voice whispered. George spun around, but no one was there. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum like a blade, cold and deliberate. His pulse quickened as he scanned the fog, but there was nothing. By the time George reached the abandoned pier again, the fog had crept inland, curling around the rocks and wooden planks like fingers. The offerings at the end of the pier, a rusted locket, a child's shoe, a cracked compass, had grown in number. George crouched to inspect them, but a chill ran down his spine. "Ellis," the voice came again, louder this time. He stood abruptly, his flashlight darting over the fog, and then he saw it. A shadowy figure standing far out in the mist, impossibly tall and still. It didn't move, but George felt its gaze, heavy and invasive, like it was peeling away the layers of his mind. He stumbled back, his breath catching. When he looked again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the mist. That night, George returned to the Harbor Inn, exhausted and shaken. He tried to review his notes, but the details blurred together. Every disappearance was marked by the same things: the heavy fog, strange sounds, and a growing sense of dread. None of it made sense. Yet, deep down, he knew the fog wasn't just a backdrop. It was a predator, hunting the people of Harbor Point one by one. The scratching began again around midnight. At first, it was faint, like nails against wood. Then it grew louder, more deliberate, coming from the window. George approached cautiously, his flashlight in hand. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, thick and unyielding. He could see shapes shifting within it, just out of focus. And then he saw them. Eyes. Two enormous, burning eyes stared back at him. George stumbled backward, his heart racing. When he looked again, the eyes were gone, but the fog lingered, heavier than before. The next day, George ventured into the woods. The townsfolk said the fog was strongest there, spreading like a living thing through the trees. George carried a flashlight, but its beam barely cut through the mist. The whispers started as he ventured deeper. "Ellis." He stopped, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Ellis, come closer." The voice wasn't loud, but it surrounded him, coming from every direction. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice trembling. The fog shifted, revealing shadowy figures standing just beyond the light. They weren't human, not anymore. Their forms were twisted, their faces blurred, their limbs unnaturally long. "Ellis," they whispered in unison. George's breath came in short gasps. "What do you want?" One figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. When it spoke, its voice was layered, a cacophony of whispers overlapping each other. "You called us first," it said. George froze. "I don't understand." "You invited us when you looked, when you listened." The ground beneath his feet shifted, soft and wet, like like the bottom of a drained pond. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud. George turned and ran. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the figures closing in. Branches clawed at his face, and the fog tugged at his clothes like hands. When he burst out onto the street, the whispers stopped. The fog retreated, slinking back into the woods, as if it had never been there. George stood there, trembling, the roar still echoing in his mind. He left Harbor Point the next morning. The case was never solved. The missing teenagers were never found, nor was Marion Graves. The fog eventually lifted, but its memory lingered, etched into the town's crumbling walls. George never spoke of what he'd seen, but the whispers followed him. On quiet nights, he swore he could hear his name carried on the wind. Ellis. The fog was waiting.